LSU ran for about half a mile yesterday en route to a 49-42 win over Florida. Maybe the most stunning outcome for me personally this season. I cannot tell you how confident I was in Florida running the score up on LSU yesterday. And instead we get this. So just consider what you witnessed yesterday. Because this was a monumental upset in so many different ways. But yet then again, we saw it a year ago. We saw LSU gutted. We saw them as a double-digit underdog. And we saw them beat Florida. So we saw that already. But consider why yesterday was supposed to be different. First off, this is 2021. Dan Mullen told me it would be all well and good in 2021. Number two, you just had the Kentucky debacle 2 weeks ago where they beat you without even throwing for 100 yards, and you sleptwalked through that one. Number three, you know what LSU did to you last year. And number four, LSU can't run the ball to save their lives until they line up with you. This is a stat that goes beyond Padlock. I don't even know what planet this stat comes from. LSU woke up Saturday morning, okay? They were 127th in the country in total rushing. There are only like 130 teams out there. They were horrifically bad. They were historically bad. By a mile, the worst rushing product on the field in the history of LSU football. And Tyrion Davis-Price yesterday goes for 287 just by himself. LSU overall over 300. Davis-Price sets an LSU single game record. It's the most rushing yards Florida has ever given up in a game. They used to play against Herschel Walker. It's the most rushing yards they've ever given up in a game against, by a long shot, the worst Power 5 rushing offense in America. This is called being unprepared to play a football game. It's not an X's and O's thing. It's just being holistically unprepared among the X's and O's problems. So I'm going to tell you what I thought about it. When I was watching, I was in the Tennessee press box and I was watching this game yesterday. I had a little wrestling buddy growing up. By wrestling buddy, I don't mean a kid in my 6th grade gym class. I mean the stuffed wrestling buddy. You know, the one your parents buy you so that you can wrestle with it and you always win, or you're supposed to win. But see, you get tired of beating the wrestling buddy because it's an inanimate object. It's just a little stuffed doll. So you have to fight for yourself, and then you also have to fight for the wrestling buddy. So you let the wrestling buddy punch you, and then you take its leg and you let it kick you. That's basically Florida yesterday. Florida looked at LSU, a wrestling buddy. It should have been a lifeless body that you ran over and backed up and ran over again as many times as you wanted to. And instead, it's like Florida's taking LSU's leg and they're kicking themselves in the face with it. And then they take LSU's hand and then they backhand themselves with it. And at the end of the day, you had track marks all over you. And here's how bad it was. You want to know how bad a day it was for Florida yesterday? Here's how bad a day it was. Florida lost to a coach that got fired anyway. That's how bad the day was for Florida yesterday. Woof, woof, woof. Speaking of dog sounds, they still got to play Georgia in a couple of weeks. So if you want to start forecasting how ugly that one's going to be now, don't let me get in your way. Here was my fear at the beginning of the year that I'm afraid is being validated right now. My fear, going back to last year, those of you who have watched the program for a little while know, my fear was Dan Mullen was sold on going to the NFL. It turns out the NFL wasn't quite as sold on Dan Mullen, but we had reason enough to know that Dan Mullen badly wanted a shot at the NFL. It was my belief then, and it still is now, that in the middle to latter portion of last year, Mullen had convinced himself he was going to get an NFL job. Therefore, that was his last season in Gainesville. His actions last year sort of correlated with that theory. He acted in a very loose manner. He acted kind of in the way that you would if it was, March of your senior high school year. You can act in a way because you're headed out the door that you couldn't act a year ago. But then he didn't get the NFL job. Okay, worse things have happened. But my question, as it pertains to 2021 and beyond, was, is he just going to be able to check back in? And he hasn't been able to. Regardless of whether my theory is right or wrong, he hasn't been able to. This team has not been able to check back in. They've had a stretch of some really, really bad football starting last year and extending into this year. And here's the problem. The problem is, you remember that bowl game, if you want to call it a game, against Oklahoma where, Florida kind of got treated like a wrestling buddy. But Dan Mullen told you, well, the last game for this team was, against Alabama. This is next year's team. We checked out, and it was pathetic, but at least in terms of 2021, you were willing to hold your nose and maybe accept a little bit of that and say, okay, for devil's advocate purposes, maybe Dan's right, and maybe 2021 will be good. And then they almost beat Bama. And so for a little while, it puts lipstick on the pig, but man, that lipstick wore off really quick. In fact, 1 week later in Lexington, Kentucky. And he just pushed the debt down the road is all he did. They got some fundamental problems there that were not solved, and it didn't get solved with a couple of defensive assistants moving on and new guys being brought in. I cannot for the life of me figure out the quarterback dynamic. I'm starting to think that Florida fans have been as right about Anthony Richardson as Oklahoma fans were about Spencer Rattler. Maybe you guys do know your roster better than your head coach. I never say stuff like that because it can't be true, can it? But then again, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I'm not at practice. That's why I've never been one to just openly question personnel decisions. But man, when we get game film on guys, when we watch Anthony Richardson come in and we watch the product on the field, it's kind of like when Caleb Williams eventually came in for Oklahoma. You can't deny it anymore. Except the head coach of Florida is still kind of trying to deny it with the way he's operated. How does Anthony Richardson not start against Georgia? I'm going to leave that. We got a couple of weeks to talk about that. But I got asked, so obviously I get asked last night, after Florida has lost, is it time to move on from Dan Mullen? Every time a team loses, the fan base asks you, is it time to fire fill in the blank? So is it time to move on from Dan Mullen? No, I'm not there. It's got to go to step 10, 11, and maybe even 12 before I ever advocate for anyone being fired. Only because I know how hard it is to replace coaches with other quality coaches. Having said that, fundamental changes have got to be made there. And I got a couple of them, but I think in a perfect world, you make both of these changes. You've got to make a change at defensive coordinator. There's no question about this. You've got to make that change, and you've got to bring in a world-class defensive coordinator. Now, here's what I would hope. I would hope he's a world-class recruiter, too, and spare no expense to do it. John Hammond, Jurassic Park, we spare no expense. You've got to fix the recruiting apparatus there, too. I don't know how many more games, I know the Florida fans know this, but I'm kind of speaking to the choir here. How many more games do we have to see where Florida does not have the adequate caliber of athlete to bail them out of subpar performance before we know we got a recruiting issue down there? Again, Florida fans know this. They'd finish the sentence for you if they were sitting in here right now. But if it's not addressed, if defensive coordinator and the recruiting apparatus there's not addressed, then you've got what you've got with Dan Mullen. You're 4 years in now, but really you've watched his career. You've got what you've got. You got a good coach that every few years could pop an unexpected result on you. It's not going to win you a championship because you cannot out-scheme people in the playoff when you don't compare with them athletically. But maybe he'll win the SEC East in Georgia's down years. The problem is, all due respect, if this were the University of Missouri, that'd be great. This is Florida. It's not good enough. It can't be accepted as good enough. The fans don't accept it. So this is more directed at people who are actually in decision-making positions down there. But wow, I mean, I'm just telling you, it's got to sting when you get beat and it's thought so little of that they just fire the coach anyway. I know there were other circumstances involving that, but it's just on the surface, it doesn't feel good.